According to the Sumerian king list, there were only 5 cities that held the kingship before the deluge, or in other words, which served as capital cities to the antediluvian Anunnaki. The order in which they are given is the succession in which they ruled, although they were probably all built at about the same time. The reason for moving the capital from one city to the other may have been political, but on the other hand, the shifting of the watercourses due to periodic flooding and the drying up of the southern part of the Mesopotamian valley as the climate changed may have been the compelling reason for moving the capital to more northern and readily accessible cities. Strangely enough, the king list does not mention the cities of Uruk and Nippur, which were also built before the deluge. These were designed as ceremonial and sacred cities, which probably accounts for their being left out of the list. The 5 cities of the king list were strictly operational. They were operational cities built by Enki and his engineers to obtain rare metals, process them, and ferry the ingots. The 5 cities were a cohesive group, each providing an essential function to the primary purpose of the expedition. Their function is alluded to in their names and is as follows. Eridu, operational headquarters of Enki. Literally home built far away, Eridu was the first city. At this time, Eridu was the center of all operations on Earth. Here, Enki supervised the draining of the marshlands, raising the cities, establishing agriculture and animal husbandry, and generally making the land more hospitable and productive. From Eridu, Enki also directed the development of African mines, the transportation of ores, and the processing of the metals at Bat Tibera. Eridu was the first city built on this planet, which probably gave our world its name, Earth, the 3rd planet in our solar system. The origin of the word Earth is unknown, and its origin was lost in antiquity, but logically and linguistically it can be traced back to Eridu. Also, Enki's alternative name was Ea, which just happens to occur in the word Earth. The name assigned to their planet by its occupants can be traced back to the root Eridu. In Old High German, Earth is Erda, it is Erte in Middle English, Era in Greek, Eretz in Aramaic, and Eretz in Hebrew, to name just a few. It seems that all philological roads lead back to the first city built on this planet by our forefathers, Eridu. Bat Tibera, the metals processing center. The name Bad Tibera means city where the ores are processed. In the king list, it retained kingship for the longest time of all the cities, almost half of the time recorded before the deluge, which indicates its primary importance among the cities. Sumerian Tibera is derived from the same Proto-Sumerian substrata word as Hebrew Tubal, which means metalworker. This relationship is seen in Genesis, wherein Tubal-Cain, the son of the patriarch Lamech, is credited with the invention of metals. Tubal-Cain, who forged the various implements of copper and iron. Bad Tibera was the first strictly operational city built by Enki, and reflects why the Anunnaki came here to obtain and process certain metals, presumably gold and silver, and perhaps other rare metals. The king list assigns Bat Tibera to Nugig, or Nu-Gig, which means he of the bright sky, and was an epithet for Nanna, the favorite son of Enlil. Arriving by ship from the African mines, the ores would be processed at Bat Tibera into a transportable form. Larak, the control center. The name La Raka means see the bright light, and the 3rd city assigned the kingship. Its name indicates its function, that of guiding the metal freighters arriving and leaving Mesopotamia. The king list has the city assigned to Pabil Sag, meaning the Great Protector, and it was one of the titles of Ninurta, the military aide of Enlil, who recovered the Mies from the rebel Sun Tzu. Little is known of this city, and like that of Bat Tibera, has not been located archaeologically. Ninurta in Egypt was Ptah, Zu or Marduk in Egypt was Amon-Ra, the Baal of the Bible. Sipar, the platform. The 4th city built was Sippar, or Bird City. It was the landing platform, especially for those hauling metal cargo. One of the Sumerian myths states that this city was built for the god Utu, one of the circles of 7 great gods who decreed the fates. Better known as Shamash, his Akkadian and Semitic name, Utu was chief of the astronauts. When the platform and related activities were moved to the western lands, i.e. Sinai, after the deluge, Shamash was placed in charge of Baalbek and the land of Lebanon. Since it was the stairway to the stars, Sippar was of significant importance among the antediluvian cities. Its sole king, Enmedu-Rana, literally means the Lord whose Mies bond heaven and earth, an allusion to his ability to control events between Sippar and the orbiting ship. Enmedu-Rana was himself the hero of a Sumerian tradition that has him transported to heaven, much like the biblical Enoch, who was also translated to heaven. The evidence that identifies Enoch as Enmedu-Rana is found in the writings of the pseudepigrapha, discussed in a few minutes. Shuruppak, the chief medical center. The 5th city to be built was Shuruppak, or the place of the utmost well-being. This city was dedicated to the chief nurse and medical officer of the expedition, the goddess Ninhursag. She tended to the medical needs of the Anunnaki and humans from her temple, the ziggurat at Shuruppak. Uruk, the sacred city of the great god Anu. Uruk, or Great City, was dedicated to the chief god Anu. Its temple atop the ziggurat was the ceremonial center for Sumer. His residence was away from his city and on visits to Earth, which became less frequent as the world became more populated. Anu's influence seems to have declined in the days before the deluge, and his authority was taken over by Enlil. Since he rarely used his ceremonial city, Anu turned it over to Inanna at her request. She institutionalized her control over the city of Uruk by obtaining the necessary powers and authorities in the Mies, which she extracted from Enki, as we have seen. Nippur, administrative center of Enlil. This was the city dedicated to Enlil, and where he ruled from his Ekor, or house on the mountain. At Nippur, Enlil exercised supreme command over all the Anunnaki on Earth before the deluge. One of the hymns dedicated to him provides a graphic description of a control center bristling with communications and other electronic equipment scanning the horizons. From the Ekor, it was said that Enlil's eye scans the land, and his lifted beam searches the heart of all the lands. Nippur was rebuilt after the deluge as his sacred city. According to the 3rd book of Enoch, the Lord kept his Shekhinah, or spacecraft, here, at the Garden of Eden, in the days of Enosh, when abruptly left for his heavenly abode and vowed never to return except on special occasions. At Nippur, Ezekiel first saw the fiery chariot, which is described so vividly in the book of Ezekiel. The Abzu, or floating palace of Enki. Abzu, or Apsu in Akkadian, is derived from the combination of Ab, or Ap, meaning the father, the creator, or the great one, and Zu, or Su, meaning one who knows, the wise one, thus suggesting it was the source of all wisdom and knowledge. The Abzu seems to have had 3 different meanings to the Mesopotamians, depending on the period to which the tablets refer. Originally, Abzu was the term for our sun. In the Sumerian creation myth, the Abzu is called the primeval one and the begetter of the planets of our solar system. Later, when the Anunnaki had arrived here and began to set up operations, the Abzu is clearly the abode of Enki, located near Eridu. After the deluge, it becomes the deep, from whence derived the Greek word abyssos and the modern abyss, and refers to the netherworld, presumably to the ancient mines. Mining does not seem to be the main preoccupation of the post-Diluvian period. While they may still have been operational and worked on a limited basis by the population, they had become mainly a place of detention. It is the second meaning, that of the floating headquarters of Enki, that pervades the literature relating to the antediluvian days. In the myth Enki and the World Order, one of the longest and best preserved narrative poems, the Abzu of Eridu, is described as a splendid shrine, nestled among the shade trees filled with birds and navigable canals stocked with fish. In this Eden-like garden, Enki takes pleasure trips over the marshland and canals in his Magur-type boat, which he refers to as the Ibex of the Abzu. This ship is presumably some sort of small runabout, as Magur means ship to turn about in. The Ibex is an allusion to the wild goat of the surrounding mountains, and is often used to represent the person of Enki on cylinder seals and statuettes. The most beautiful of these is the statue of the Ibex peering through a shrub, found in the royal palace at Ur and dated to 2500 BC. Lavishly done in gold and lapis lazuli, it shows a winged ibex peering through a shrub representing the tree of life or immortality. Enki is often depicted as residing in this Abzu or water palace. A cylinder seal of about 2000 BC shows it as his home surrounded by water. It was probably a sealed mobile craft as well, as indicated in the Gilgamesh epic, where Utnapishtim, the Babylonian Noah, is told to close his ark thoroughly to make it waterproof. Like the Abzu, thou shalt seal her, he is told. The Abzu thus appears to be sealed like a ship, and probably was submersible as well. Before Enki built the first city, he resided in the Abzu, which had descended from the heavens to settle in the swamps of Mesopotamia. Presumably, it was of such a configuration that it could fly and was submersible as well. Enki as the Oannes of the Babylonian legends. The traditions of ancient Mesopotamia recount the story of an amphibious ancestor who taught the arts and crafts of civilization to humanity. In the 3rd century BC, the Babylonian priest Berosus describes the origins of civilization as his forefathers believed it. Although the works of Berosus have been lost, many fragments have been preserved by several contemporary writers such as Apollodorus, Alexander Polyhistor, and Abidenes, one of Aristotle's disciples who also wrote an Assyrian history of his own, now lost. The account speaks of a group of creatures who came out of the Persian Gulf called Anidotai, led by one Oannes. They reportedly were amphibious creatures with the head of a man, the body and tail of a fish, yet legged like a man. Led by Oannes, these creatures taught man all of the ancient knowledge. According to the legend, Oannes instructed man to build cities, found temples, compile laws, survey the lands and grow food. He also taught them mathematics, the sciences and every kind of art. Apollodorus referred to Oannes and the Anidotai as Musarus. The word Musarus means an abomination in Greek, just as anecdote means the repulsive ones. In other words, the creatures credited with founding civilization were frankly described by the ancient Babylonian people who revered them as repulsive. If the tradition had been invented, a more normal attitude would be to glorify these creatures as splendid gods and heroes. Yet the fact that they chose to describe their ancestors this way argues for the account's authenticity. The Babylonian tradition owed their knowledge to creatures who came up from the sea, who were disgusting and loathsome to gaze upon. Of further significance is that the Oannes of Berosus and Apollodorus bears a striking resemblance to the Sumerian Enki, who founded the Mesopotamian civilization and brought civilized arts and sciences to humanity. Enki lived in his water palace or Abzu, located on the edge of the Persian Gulf. Enki's Abzu was sealed and was presumably submersible. Oannes was said to return to his watery abode in the evening to spend the night. Even the name Anidotai is quite similar to the people of Enki, the Anunnaki, from where it was probably derived. The Greek term may have originated with the Sumerians and was later carried over as a description of a loathsome race. When our Anunnaki ancestors arrived here to exploit the resources of this planet, they must have found the physical conditions here ideal for living, perhaps very similar to those of their home planet. What were these conditions that were so compatible with a race that came here hundreds of thousands of years ago? When Anunnaki arrived, the Earth's climate was moist and stable, not running to the extremes in temperature as it is today. This was due to the enormous moisture being held in the Earth's atmosphere, a veritable cloud canopy. This condition is described in the book of Genesis as the separation of waters. It is in this moist climate that the Anunnaki arrived to exploit the Earth's resources. They were a sapient race and found conditions here very congenital to their existence, as it was similar to their home planet. It is no accident that all the early settlements were founded at the mouth of large river systems where moisture was abundant. Besides the Tigris and Euphrates, other civilizations sprang up in the Nile Delta and the Indus River system. They were actually offshoots of the main colony in Mesopotamia. The meaning of the separation of waters. According to the creation story in the book of Genesis, the waters were all commingled together at one point. Then they were divided. God said, "Let there be an expanse in the middle of the water to form a division between the waters." And it was so. God made the expanse, and it divided the water below it from the water above it. The separation of the waters, with half remaining on the Earth's surface and half going into the upper atmosphere, is also mentioned in the Book of Jubilees. One of the lost books of the Bible, Jubilees, was initially written in Hebrew as an extensive retelling of Genesis and Exodus. It has been found in Greek, Syriac, Latin, and Ethiopic as well. However, the Ethiopic text is the only one that has survived in a form that is virtually complete. The Book of Jubilees makes it clear that as much moisture remained in the atmosphere as was found in the world oceans. And on the second day he made the firmament amid the water, and the waters were divided on that day. One half of them went up above, and one half of them went down beneath the firmament. Clearly, it asserted that as much moisture was held in the sky as was contained in the seas below. Berosus, in his History of Babylonia, related that at the time of creation, the whole universe consisted of moisture. In this story, it was Zeus who separated heaven and earth from one another. This condition was universally noted. Many ancient cultures refer to a time in the far past when there was no sun as we know it today. In the Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the ancient Quiche Maya, it is stated that there was a time when it was cloudy and twilight was upon the face of the earth. There was no sun yet, for the sky and the earth existed, but the face of the sun and moon were covered. The dense cloud cover or vapor canopy would mean that blue sky was seen by the ancients until after the deluge. One of the oldest pieces of Sumerian mythology, if not the oldest yet known, seems to echo the description of the Popol Vuh. It is paraphrased as follows: "The reptiles verily descend. The earth is resplendent as a well-watered garden. At that time Enki and Eridu had not appeared. Daylight did not shine. Moonlight had not emerged." A stable cloud canopy also meant that the earth had to be watered by a different regime than it is today. The book of Genesis bears this out. God had not yet sent rain upon the earth. Instead, a flow would go well up from the ground and water the whole surface of the soil. It was not until the cloud cover collapsed with the event known as the deluge that man saw sunlight and blue sky. Verification of this is also found in Genesis, which states that the Lord introduced the rainbow after the deluge. Rainbows result from the prismatic effect of the bending of the sun's rays through water droplets. Rainbows can only occur after rain and require the direct action of sunlight. The antediluvian vapor canopy of the Earth. The theory that the Earth had a primordial vapor canopy was developed by Donald Patton in his book The Biblical Flood and the Ice Epoch. He surmises that it was in some ways like that surrounding Venus today. The canopy of Venus consists primarily of carbon dioxide and hydrocarbons, with some water vapor. The Earth's primordial vapor canopy, on the other hand, was mainly composed of water vapor, some carbon dioxide, and virtually no hydrocarbons. This cloud cover condensed out at the time of the deluge. Patton believes that plant life was luxuriant in that early period because of the proportions of carbon dioxide and water vapor in the atmosphere and the capture of long-wave radiation resulting in the greenhouse effect. This greenhouse effect meant that temperatures would tend to be uniform between night and day and between summer and winter. There had to be little circulation of the atmosphere, and this absence of cyclonic activity precluded the formation of storms and other forms of precipitation. Although the Earth's surface was shielded from the direct rays of the sun, plant life was rich and abundant due to the proportion of carbon dioxide to that of water vapor in the atmosphere. The amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was probably many times higher than it is today. In their article on The Warm Earth, two climatologists, Owen Toon and Steve Olson, maintain that the Earth's early atmosphere contained as much as 1,000 times more carbon dioxide than it does today. In those days, people obtained much of their water from underground sources. As stated in Genesis 5, God had not sent rain upon the earth. Instead, a flow would go well up from the ground and water the whole surface of the soil. Water was also provided by the rivers, which descended from the mountains, fed by natural springs. The heavily saturated atmosphere was also condensed at nightfall, thus producing a heavy dew that provided moisture. This also made night conditions unbearable for humans when the heavy dew was precipitated. It may explain why caves were in wide use by early people in Europe between 60,000 and 10,000 BC. Presumably, they were used for shelter as protection from wild animals, but also, by building bonfires at their entrances, they provided relief from the oppressive climatic conditions. With a canopy of water vapor, humidity even in the daytime would have been at near maximum, and temperatures would have hovered consistently at the dew point. With the coming of night, temperatures would have dropped slightly and dew point would be quickly reached. At this time, a thick, somewhat sticky, and an uncomfortable layer of dew would begin to form. By building a bonfire at the cave's mouth, primitive people could maintain the temperature above dew point all night and increase their comfort. Desiccation of the land. During this early period, the climate was benign all over the world. The stable and moist atmosphere was ideal for the vast vegetarian dinosaurs and other large reptile forms. Had the antediluvian environment remained the same, who knows what reptilian forms would have evolved. In their analysis of why dinosaurs and reptiles became extinct, Allaby and Lovelock, in their book The Great Extinction, suggested that if the climate had remained unchanged until the present day, there is no reason to suppose that the reptiles would have declined. They maintain that, furthermore, mammals might still be living in nocturnal obscurity, and had intelligent beings evolved, let us say beings with advanced technologies, they might well have scaly skins and probably long tails. Physical conditions, however, began to change dramatically. The land started to dry out. Since there was no cyclonic activity to produce rain, moisture had to be gotten from the ground or spring-fed river systems. A limited amount of moisture was also provided by the heavily saturated atmosphere, which condensed at nightfall. The changing climate was no longer friendly to the Anunnaki. Mammals had become better adapted to the changes and were slowly replacing the reptiles as the dominant form on Earth. The lush vegetation was declining, and the Anunnaki were beginning to suffer. A Sumerian myth called the Dispute Between Cattle and Grain describes how the Anunnaki originally lived off the land. They knew not the eating of bread, knew not the dressing of garments, ate plants with their mouth like sheep, drank water from the ditch. Since conditions on Earth had changed, the Anunnaki could not feed themselves. The myth describes how two goddesses were created to help the Anunnaki obtain food, the cattle goddess Lahat and the grain goddess Ashnan. The Anunnaki could not learn to feed themselves for some reason which is not given, and the experiment proved unsuccessful. This is why the myth states further that humans were created. At this time, the Anunnaki were vegetarian, and it was not until later, when food became scarce, that they turned to eating meat. This is reflected in the Ethiopic Apocalypse of Enoch, which describes how the Nephilim began to eat the flesh of animals, all the time pleading the scarcity of vegetable food. Both religious and secular sources indicate that man and the serpent gods living among them were vegetarian and not meat-eaters. According to Genesis, man did not eat meat until after the deluge. This was not true of the Nephilim and Anunnaki, who turned to eating meat. The desiccation of the earth may have been partly caused by the numerous catastrophes of the period. Earthquakes and other natural disasters in the antediluvian period are often alluded to in religious literature and the Sumerian myths. Earthquakes and other catastrophes. Earthquakes and other natural catastrophes were not unknown to early humans, for they are mentioned in many ancient sources, both religious and secular. The Haggadah, the source of Hebrew oral tradition, refers to a period of calamities that occurred in the generation of Enosh, the second after Adam, when the earth was beset by 4 revolutions in nature, presumably a reference to major earthquakes, perhaps caused by a shift of the earth on its axis. Other ancient sources reveal that in the days of Enosh there were severe disruptions in the water supply, and that the mountains became barren. Such a shift would affect the calendar as well, especially the length of the year. In the first book of Enoch, there are several admonitions to the people against errors in the compilation of the year's length. Enoch tells Methuselah that the year is completed in 364 days, and not to note this correction would upset all the order of the days of celebration. It would thus appear that, at least for a while, the length of the year was 364 instead of 365 days. Even the Greek writer Herodotus, in his histories, refers to ancient perturbations of the earth. He was informed by the Egyptian priests of the ancient city of Heliopolis that in the preceding 10,000 years the sun had removed from its proper course 4 times. It seems that the axis of the earth had been displaced 4 times, for the sun was said by them to have changed its usual position, twice rising in the west and twice in the east. Curiously enough, the statement of Herodotus agrees with the ancient religious sources, which speak of 4 significant disturbances during the days of Enosh. The sun's eccentric behavior is also found in the Hebrew oral tradition. They affirm that in the era before the deluge, the laws of nature were suspended. The sun rose in the west and set in the east. The century before the deluge must have been one of many natural catastrophes that were a forerunner of the major one to come, the 120 years in Genesis. There is a curious statement in Genesis 6 that just precedes the deluge account, which refers to a period of 120 years. For generations, scholars have interpreted the verse by the Lord to mean that man was granted a lifespan of 120 years. The account of Genesis says, "My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh, but his days shall be 120 years." However, this interpretation relating to human lifespan seems odd, because the text deals with God's intent to destroy humanity in the coming deluge. If so, then why offer humans long life? Subsequent statements in Genesis do not support such an arbitrary lifespan. After the deluge, the descendants of Noah lived longer than the limit of 120 years. Shem lived to be 600, his son Arphaxad to be 483, his son Salah to be 433, and so on down to Abraham, who died at the ripe old age of 175. Isaac then lived to be 180, and Jacob 147, and it was not until generations later, with Moses, who died at 120, that the so-called prophecy appeared to come true. Furthermore, since the days of Moses, there has been a steady decline in human lifespan, until today, when 80 plus is considered to be the average. Obviously, the statement in Genesis does not apply to lifespans, but to something else, whose meaning was omitted during the early formative years of the Old Testament. Moreover, the location of this fragment immediately before the account of the deluge strongly suggests that it is somehow related to the universal catastrophe. This testimony is brought out in many of the ancient religious documents. Ancient rabbinical literature, for example, relates how Noah had been informed of the coming catastrophe 120 years before. and told to exhort the people to mend their ways. In other words, the 120 years was one of probation, when humans were given the choice of avoiding destruction by changing their habits. A similar warning is pronounced in the Slavonic Apocalypse of Enoch, also called the Second Book of Enoch. Still, here the warning is given to Methuselah instead of Noah, who is told to warn people to mend their ways because the destruction of Earth draws near. Methuselah was also informed that the Earth will change its seasons in anticipation of the time of destruction. Apparently, there would be bad disturbances on Earth during this interim period of 120 years. During this interval, conditions on the Earth were unsettled, and numerous disturbances anticipated the significant destruction to come. The skies of the period must have been terrifying, for the solar system was playing a game of celestial ping-pong. The Second Book of Enoch tells of chaos just before the deluge, when society broke down and when peoples and nations waged war against each other. References to such unrest are not limited to religious documents, but are also found in the Sumerian cuneiform literature. In the Atrahasis epic, the Babylonian account of the deluge, man is afflicted with plagues and other pestilences just before the disaster. Interruptions in the flow of waters from the mountains caused the Mesopotamian plains to become salty and unproductive. This reduction of fresh water allowed the Persian Gulf to back up the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. As a result, the waters became brackish, and as the epic describes it, the fountains were stopped so that the flood could not rise at the source. The field diminished its product. The wide-open plain brought forth salt. Her bosom revolted so that no plant came forth, no grain sprouted. The Eden of the Bible had become a desolate, brackish plain. According to the epic, living conditions had become unbearable. A dwindling food supply was not the only problem. Using the genealogy of the Book of Genesis as a source of demographics, it can be shown that there was a high population density in that area. Assuming there were 20 offspring per family, a very conservative figure considering the long life of the inhabitants and the system of polygamy, and counting only 10 generations from Adam to Noah, the extraordinary total of over 1 billion people can be deduced. While this number may be mathematically correct, logically, it represents an impossible census for the number of people existing at the time of the onset of the deluge. More likely, it suggests that there was an extremely high mortality rate among humans.